Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to another Augusta Co-op Row Report, February 16th. I am Troy Grimm, Agronomy Manager for Augusta Co-op, and we're going to talk a little bit about small grain. We're getting to the time of year here, middle of February, that we want to start thinking about scouting, top dressing, weed control, and small grains. Here in the Shenandoah Valley, we grow lots of different small grains, barley, wheat, triticale, ryegrass, oats. So very diverse mix of small grains, and they're either combined for grain. A lot of them are used for forage, whether chopped or in baleage. So small grains are very important to our growers here, especially in the forage-based programs, whether it be dairy or beef cattle, either one. So let's talk a little bit about what we would normally do this time of year and what we should be looking for this time of year. So obviously scouting is very important. Get out and look at this small grain. What we're going to be scouting for is a couple different things. We're going to scout for weed pressure. If there is any weed pressure, if the weed pressure is bad enough to spray for, and what that weed pressure is. Whether that's henbed, chickweed, dead nettle, where we have some mustard in it, different kind of weeds. In wheat, maybe there's some ryegrass or some bluegrass. We need to determine what those pressures are, our weed pressures are, or unwanted plants, and then what we need to do to fix those. Lots of options for spraying small grain for weeds, depending on the weed with what you would use, but lots of options there, so that's very important to determine what we need to do there. Some of that will be determined by how early the small grain was planted, or maybe the better term is how well it's tillered this time of year. Obviously, if small grain is planted early, like barley planted in September, early September especially, should be very well tillered now and have the ground covered pretty good and help you a lot with weed control. But then conversely, if a small grain corn was shelled late, small grain was put in late, and it really hasn't had a chance to till, there's a lot of open soil there to cause a lot more weed issues, and obviously you may have a lot more weed pressure there and have to do more weed control in those situations. So we're just depending on what the small grain looks like is what your weed pressure will be and what you may want to use. Sometimes depending on what the crop actually is, whether barley, wheat, triticale, ryegrass and triticale, oats, depending on what that is what kind of weed control you use. We have some growers here that will use some barley with some cowpeas in it, oats with cowpeas, so obviously that really limits what you can do weed control wise once you plant a legume in with your small grain. So after we've kind of looked at our weed pressure, we want to make sure that we don't have any insect pressure. And you may say, well, it's too early for insect pressure now. We don't have any cereal leaf beetle now. Well, what we have seen, at least here in the Shenandoah Valley, sometimes it's been heavily concentrated in rye crops, is cherry oat aphids we will find in our small grain. Sometimes you see a small grain turn purple, especially turn purple pretty quickly. You can have some cherry oat aphids. That's not necessarily always the case if it turns purple, but that's one of the things to look for, and one of the things we really look for in our small grain here early in the spring, to make sure we don't have any aphid pressure. Don't see it every year, but it is something we do see some. Obviously, as the crop moves on and we get closer into March, maybe into first part of April, we will be looking for cereal leaf beetle, which can be a problem for grain production, and we do see that on occasion, not in every field, but we do see it some, and need to take care of that as needed. Obviously, we need to make sure the pressure is bad enough to treat. We don't want to kill every insect in the field, just the bad ones. So if the pressure's high enough, we will treat for those insects. So once you kind of determine what your weed pressure is, and if you have any insect pressure or not needs to be taken care of, then we need to kind of be looking at our tiller counts and kind of how our stand is. A lot of this is going to heavily depend on when the crop is planted. Here in the Shenandoah Valley, a lot of corn gets chopped for silage, and when that corn gets chopped, it's usually chopped fairly early in the fall, and small grain put in right behind it should generally have a good, a nice stand, good tillers, as long as we've had rain in the fall. This past year we had a nice fall. Our barley stands look extremely good, especially the ones planted early, as well as our wheat and triticale type crops. They all look really good if they were planted early enough. We had some wet weather kind of later on in the fall, and some crops didn't get put in until maybe December. Obviously, they are not very large now and not tillered very much. So by looking at those stands and finding out kind of what our tiller counts are and what we think we can get in spring tillers is would determine how much nitrogen we may or may not put on that crop. So very important to go out and look at those stands and see what our tiller counts are and go from there. Like barley, an average tiller count on barley is going to be 4 to 5 tillers. Wheat really depends on what your yield goals are and what your planting rate has been. But generally here in the valley, if you're going to combine wheat for grain, they want 70 to 90 bushels. 100 would be great. Doesn't happen very often. But if you want 80 bushel wheat, for instance, you need to have 80 heads per square foot as a general rule. So tiller count on wheat is really important just simply because of our fertilizer application and yield potential, and that fertilizer application needs to be matched to that yield potential as best you can. If you go out and check a field of wheat that's got 110 or 120 heads per square foot or tillers per square foot, good live active tillers, then maybe we want to get that nitrogen application up to 100 or 120 pounds. I don't know that we need to go to 150. It really doesn't do us any good. We need to kind of make sure we don't go overboard with nitrogen, but I think that's something that's important. If you have 60 per square foot, I don't think you need to put 120 pounds on. We need to back that nitrogen up to match more what the yield is. So when you start thinking about nitrogen, one of the most important things in the spring, even if you put nitrogen on when this crop was planted back in October, you're talking about wheat, or September for barley, triticale, you wouldn't have put very much. 20 or 30 pounds would have been the most, in my opinion. And we need to think about, when we do this nitrogen, if we can get on here early in the middle of February, and in February, do we do a split application? Do we put our weed control and some liquid nitrogen on now, maybe 30, 40 pounds? Let that nitrogen help to get some spring tillers as we move into March, and our weather starts to warm up, and you get a few days, a week that are above 55 or around 55, you get some spring tillering. And once we get to growth stage 30, that all stops. But at least take advantage a little bit of this springtime tillering ability. And then, like I say, do some then, and then go back and put your bulk on into March after the tillering is over. So that's all something we need to look at as we go into this. Stands that have a really good stand, heavy stands of barley with good tillering. And do we just go ahead and put all of our nitrogen on at one time, using a nitrogen stabilizer, whatever we need to do there. So that's an important factor to look into, and tillering would kind of play into that as well. Yield goals will play into that as well. So, a lot of times what we got to do is, if he's going to do a split application, do weed control and liquid nitrogen, and come back over the second pass with dry fertilizer. When we don't need weed control, dry fertilizers will work just fine, and a pretty quick way to put the product down. Another thing we need to consider, especially in a forage crop, we have a lot of forage crop, small grains here in the valley, is sulfur. When we add sulfur to our nitrogen, it does a couple things. It allows the plant to use the nitrogen more efficiently. And for forage crops, it will dramatically increase the protein. A lot of guys that are doing forage crops for dairies, especially, are really looking for high feed quality. We're using 20 plus pounds of sulfur in the spring on this small grain to increase the protein, and it really has shown that the more sulfur you put on, to a point, the better protein you'll have in that small grain, and that's kind of what we're looking for in small grain. In a lot of cases that are mowed in boot stage, you're not looking for energy, you're looking for the protein. So that's something to be really aware of. Also helps in grain yield as well. We're sulfur deficient now. We don't get the acid rain that we got 30 years ago, so we need to think about sulfur as a really important part of not only yield but also quality, especially in the forage side. As I mentioned before, we got to continue to look for insects as this crop moves on in its growth stage, and cereal leaf beetle will be the main problem we're going to see here in the Shenandoah Valley as the crop get older. Like I said, we don't see it every year, but we certainly see it some years in some fields, and sometimes we need to get that taken care of. So small grain, you can put some small grains here in the spring. We have a lot of folks that'll put oats in, spring oats, and it works very, very well for forage crop. And we're getting to the point where around the 1st of March, we want to think about getting that planted, weather permitting. This year is going to be a challenge here in the valley. We're very, very wet, a lot more winter weather this year than we've had in several years. It's going to be a challenge to get this small grain top dressed and weeds addressed, but continue to work at that. But now's the time to be looking. If the snow's off and you can go out and look at these small grains, now's the time to get it done and start making a plan for your herbicide and nitrogen fertilizer applications in small grains. Small grains are a very important part of our forage-based program here in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, and something you can really gain feed production with if it's taken care of correctly, managed correctly. So that's what we have for small grain. This is Troy Grimm, agronomy manager with Augusta Co-op, and that's this month's Augusta Co-op Road Report. Thank you.